Hey kids! Seems like literacy in 2020 is so poor that the only way you can explain anything is to make a stream or YouTube video about it. So here we are. The New World preview just finished. I liked it, but the popular opinion among the kinds of people who spend all day talking about MMOs online is that the combat is poor. There's a saying about game development which goes something like, when a player tells you they're not happy, they're always right. But when a player tells you what you should change to make them happy, they're usually always wrong. So with that in mind, let's talk about New World combat. New World has the same fundamental combat mechanics as Dark Souls. Some people may get upset when you make that comparison, but having the same fundamental mechanics doesn't mean that New World PvE is as challenging as Dark Souls, or that your experience with the game will be similar in any way. It just means that the core design principles are the same under the hood. Those design principles are active defense options which allow you to block or dodge attacks, attacks which have startup, active and recovery animations which can be read, animations which commit you to the action, preventing other actions like movement or defense from working until you've recovered, attacks which deal damage via hitboxes in the game world that are capable of missing based on spacing, and attacks which cause hit stun, allowing one attacker to interrupt the other by hitting first. While there are obviously lots of other similarities to Souls, it's those mechanics which determine how the combat works at the most basic level. The same ideas exist in both Souls and New World, and in Monster Hunter and in Dragon's Dogma, and if you're a fighting game player you'll recognise that they exist in every fighting game. You can go back 30 years and you'll find the same principles in Street Fighter 2. They are the tried and true methods of producing interesting melee combat, but they're absent from almost every other MMO on the market. So unfortunately, the majority of people who exclusively play MMOs have no experience with these mechanics, and their knee-jerk reaction to them has been to ask for them to be changed back to something that they're more familiar with. If you have 10 or 20 years experience with one kind of design, and you weren't expecting to be taken out of your comfort zone, then I guess that's an expected reaction.
What the hell? What the hell?
Let's talk about how these Souls-like mechanics actually work then. Actually, I want to call them fighting game mechanics, but let's use Souls instead because it's an easier example to relate to New World. Dark Souls is a game where you only have 2 attack buttons, and for a lot of weapons you might as well only have 1 attack button. Despite there being very little choice in the attacks that you use, the game offers significant depth of play because it makes the decision of when and where to attack more important. It's a game about timing and spacing, where every action is a commitment and you need to think and consider the situation on screen before you commit to any action at all. Take a look at the following clips of me using the same button against the same enemy doing the same attack. In a traditional MMO I'd be making the same decision. I decided to press R2. But the outcome of some of these clips are entirely different to the others. Sometimes I deal no damage and take significant damage myself. Sometimes the complete opposite happens. The outcomes of these interactions are not random, they're based on small differences in timing and spacing. Those small differences are the decisions that you make as a player which completely alter the outcome of a fight. This is where the decision-making process lies in Souls. The challenge isn't in selecting which move to use, the challenge is in how you use that move. When you press the button, where you press the button from, which direction you face in, and whether you press the button at all. In Souls, before you press a button, you have to make a decision about whether it's a good idea to press a button. That only becomes a question because there's a cost involved with performing any action, and that cost may make the action a terrible idea. The cost is not the stamina cost of the attack. The real cost is the commitment which comes from being locked into the animation. You cannot block or roll in the middle of an R1 in Dark Souls, which means that if you press R1 with the wrong timing, or from the wrong position, then you just fucked yourself. Now think about an equivalent situation in a tab target MMO, for want of a better term. Imagine I'm standing in front of a mob and I've got a rogue in World of Warcraft. What am I going to press? I'm going to press Sinister Strike. When am I going to press it? Straight away. Why wouldn't I? Which position am I going to use it from? It doesn't matter, because I can move at all times during the action, and pressing it from out of range won't do anything, so I can't miss. What information do I need to consider before I press the button? None at all. If the enemy begins to cast a spell and I already committed to Sinister Strike, it doesn't matter, because my interrupt is off global cooldown, so committing to Sinister Strike doesn't prevent me from performing an interrupt. It doesn't prevent me from running, or vanishing, or cloaking a spell. There's no thought process before I use it, because I can never use it in the wrong way. It becomes a default action, not a decision. The fact that I may have 4 or 5 different damage abilities that I cycle through to attack things still doesn't present a decision that's equivalent to using a single R1 in Dark Souls, because those abilities don't interact with the target or with anything else on the screen in any way. That's why in this kind of tab target MMO the choices you make can be distilled down to one simple question, and that's which ability am I going to press next? That's your game. It's just a series of 1.5 second global cooldown compartments that abilities are slotted into, and you just decide upon the order. This is a real guide video, by the way. Listen to this guy.
Point eviscerate, or just 5-point eviscerate, and then get maybe a 3-point slice and dice after that. Then you'll have that little slice and dice to buffer you to build up another 5 combo points, and then put a...
It's only natural then that somebody who's spent their whole life playing some iteration of that system will become upset if they're presented with a game which doesn't have 20 different abilities to choose from. There's no choice and no depth, they'll say, because in their mind the decision-making process is about which ability you put in your next compartment, and this game of timing and spacing doesn't make any sense to them. This is a problem for the game developer to solve. You want people to understand and appreciate your game, so it's necessary to teach your game's mechanics to the player. Dark Souls is successful because it is an excellent teacher, and the approach used by Dark Souls to teach its mechanics is simple. If the player doesn't pay attention to when, where, and if they should attack, Dark Souls kills them. They die, drop all of their souls, and go back to the bonfire, and they'll keep getting killed until they stop automatically attacking and think about how they should use their abilities, not just which ability they should use next. But imagine for a second that Dark Souls had an easy mode for game journalists, where messing up your timing and spacing and getting hit in the face repeatedly didn't actually kill you. How would the player learn the game's mechanics? Well, they wouldn't. Wildly swinging at things and trading damage would be sufficient to get you through the game, so the threat of death, which is supposed to push the player, prompting them to find ways to hit things without getting hit, wouldn't be there to do its job. People who picked up the genre for the first time in easy mode would learn nothing. They'd mash their way to the end of the game, and then they'd probably complain that the game's combat was shallow and needed more abilities. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the current problem with New World. It's a game with all of the core mechanics of a Souls-like, pitched at an unfamiliar player base who need to be taught how to play a Souls-like, how to hit without being hit, but it lacks the necessary training tool that will be needed to teach them, because getting hit in New World PvE doesn't matter. It's an MMO, and the difficulty of enemies is set exactly as you would expect for an MMO. The level 1 zombie on the beach is never going to kill you, so you never have any incentive to worry about being hit by it. In Dark Souls, the threat of death forces players to make survivability their priority. It makes people play carefully and think about the correct time to act. But without the threat of death, there's no reason for players to be concerned with survivability. Instead of survivability then, their priority will be speed. If you can't die, then the only thing you care about is killing mobs as quickly as possible to maximise loot and XP. And how do you achieve that? Well, at the moment you achieve that by mashing the left mouse button with a hatchet. That, in a nutshell, is where the game is going wrong. It doesn't matter that you can reactively defend, that you can space yourself and use timing to interrupt enemies, if the game never rewards you for doing so, and never penalises you for ignoring its mechanics. As things stand, hatchet left-clicking with self-heal on kill is actively encouraged by the game. So the people doing exactly that and complaining that this is all the game is about, technically they aren't even wrong. So the question is, how do we fix it? Well, obviously we can't use the Dark Souls option of killing people on the beach at level 1 for pressing left click at the wrong time. That's never going to fly. We have to accept that the game isn't going to be Dark Souls hard, and that as a result players are still going to prioritise speed over survivability in PvE. What we need to do then is change the content so that the fastest way to clear content is to interact with the game's mechanics instead of to ignore them. There are ways to do this, and the best way is to change how enemy attacks work. Let's take a look at how PvE mobs work in New World. Enemies have some basic attacks which are weak and will be interrupted if you hit them first. They also all have attacks which are used to break out of stagger. If you're smacking an enemy with repeated light attacks, then after usually 2 attacks, they're going to blow through that spam with a grit attack. Grit is the New World equivalent of hyper armor, and it's indicated by this white flash at the start of the animation. These attacks are obviously necessary, otherwise every staggerable mob will be locked down forever by light attacks. The problem is these grit attacks are designed in a way which makes it easier and more efficient to just get hit by them and carry on mashing, rather than to try and defend against them. That's because far too many of them come out very quickly, or at least they appear to when playing online. So for many of these attacks, if the player has already committed to a light attack when the grit attack starts, it's too late to block or dodge them. In Souls, that would be fine, because in Souls the focus on survivability would prompt the player to wait and defend against the attack first, to then attack safely from the recovery time. But in New World, where the focus is going to be on speed, nobody is going to not attack just so they can be ready to dodge a fast hit and punish it, because waiting for the enemy to attack is slower than just mashing, getting hit, and continuing to mash. Some of these mobs in particular, like alligators and big cats, seem designed to be anti-fun, by giving them instant unseeable swings that there's no way to realistically deal with. This just leads to players trading damage back and forth instead of playing around enemy attacks, because if you can't reactively defend, then your only choice is a race to the death. If we want the player to respond to these attacks in time, then they need to have a long enough startup animation so that somebody who's already committed to one light attack before they see the flash can still defend. Then, since there's no threat of death, we need to make the difference between eating the hit and avoiding the hit meaningful in terms of speed. You do this with both the carrot and the stick. Give the new, slower grit attacks damage reduction during their wind-up, so that mashing through them isn't encouraged. Then have those grit attacks knock the player over, or apply a short debuff that slows the player down in some way. Maybe give them 6 seconds of reduced attack if they get hit. Then you can give the mob vulnerability frames at the end of their grit attack animation, so that if you attack immediately after blocking or avoiding the grit attack, you deal bonus damage, let's say plus 50%. Now it's faster to interact with the mechanics than to ignore them. If you successfully defend against the attack, you get bonus damage. If you eat the attack, you get knocked over and slowed down. I wish I had better footage as a visual aid, but as an example, let's talk about the bat demons. Remember the bat demons? They have this dumb screech attack that comes out almost immediately and knocks you over. You can react to it, but only if you're just standing there waiting for it. The thing is, nobody is going to stand around waiting for it, because it's faster to just do as much damage as possible, eat the screech, stand up and carry on. Now, imagine we add an extra half second or an extra second to the initial telegraph of that screech. Enough time so that, as long as you're not mindlessly mashing, you can stop what you're doing and defend against it. Then imagine that after you've defended against it, the bat has this brief period of vulnerability where it lands and takes extra damage. Not a long period, just long enough so that if you saw the screech and rolled forwards through it, you can now weapon swap and spread shot that fucker in the face for 150% and one-shot it. That would feel great. That would feel like you're actually interacting with the enemy and being rewarded for using the game's mechanics properly. This is how you teach gameplay through PvE, and it's also how you stop people complaining that your combat is boring. You can add variety to this idea by doing things like having extremely short vulnerability windows where you can only just catch the bonus damage if you space out the attack and whiff punish it with a charged heavy, or you can mix up mob attacks where some are best punished after a block and some are best dodged to reward players for finding the best solution. Make the challenging enemies challenging not by giving them instant hits, but by giving them expanded movesets where different attacks need to be dealt with in different ways, and the player has to identify individual animations to punish them properly. That's the soul of action combat, the interaction between the player and the enemy, or between the player and the player. Everything you do depends on everything they do. It's what this design offers over the typical tab target MMO. The other player's mistake is actually an opportunity. And for the love of God, take the 20% heal off the hatchet, because that was a horrible idea. Implement those changes along with some extra enemy variety, and I think you're well on the way to having fun PvE. The mechanics to make the combat interesting are already there, but the game just needs to teach and reward the use of those mechanics if we want people to engage with them. Once you've got the PvE sorted, we then need to talk about PvP. All of the PvP footage I've seen of people new to the preview looks the same. Every single player burns all of their stamina immediately, for no reason, makes no attempt to get it back, then gets hit by a guy spamming left click with a hatchet. They continue to hold sprint in the middle of hitstone, which pauses stamina regen, preventing them from getting any stamina back, and they attempt to escape by smashing the jump input, which has no iframes, costs half your stamina bar, and will result in your death. This is happening because we haven't taught players otherwise. The PvE element of the game is supposed to be a training ground for the game's controls where people learn to play, but nothing in PvE teaches the player about stamina management or escaping repeated hits. Rewarding players for using their defensive options will help, but we also need some encounters which will mimic the sort of day one PvP experience that people run into. For that, I'd propose adding a new enemy type, which is a human carrying a hatchet. You can call him Hatchet Man. The AI for Hatchet Man works like this. When you aggro him, Hatchet Man will run up to the 10 meter range and then do sprinting attack immediately. After he's done sprinting attack, Hatchet Man then uses 8 hatchet light attacks in a row, on the spot, regardless of whether you're in range or not. Instead of a grit attack, when you stagger him, Hatchet Man will roll backwards, then 2 seconds after rolling backwards, the AI routine just loops. Make sure the 8 hatchet light attacks are tight enough that you can't sprint jump out of them. That's it, that's all you need. Stick Hatchet Man on the new player shoreline, and I assure you he will do some work. And then after the 10th death to Hatchet Man, players like popular children's entertainer Asmongold, who thought that burning all their stamina on jumping in the middle of combat was a good idea, will know otherwise. And it will be easy for people to understand how grit mechanics let them blow through those light attacks, and the differences between the weight classes. See how people's opinions change after that. Anyway, that's my piece. Point being, the common complaints about the game are coming from people who are new to these mechanics. Their suggestions are all focused on changing the game into something they're more familiar with, but that's only because the game so far isn't doing a good job of teaching people. Consider what the players' priorities are, and then teach them where the fun is by rewarding them for engaging with the system. The depth is there, there's just no carrot yet for seeking it out. I'll be keeping my eye on this one because the foundations of the game are more interesting than anything else on the market. See you next time.